Broadcasting from the Cass Corridor in Detroit, this is The Metro, a slice of news, culture, and conversation. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Today on the program, we hear from Detroit native filmmaker Lawrence Lamont about his new comedy that just debuted #1 at the box office. It's called One of Them Days.
Plus, we don't have to tell you it's cold outside, really cold outside, and that means those lucky enough to crank up the heat are doing so.
And it has some of us worried about the energy bills we'll see in a couple weeks. So as energy costs continue to rise, we're wondering more and more.
How did we get here? And what would it look like to transition to clean energy sources?
We'll take a step back and forward, and we'll take your calls, 313-577-1019. But first, the city of Detroit has been working to build a friendly landscape for electric vehicles. This month, the city and the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments received $15 million federal dollars to build a network of EV charging stations.
And Robin, that money speaks to this broader effort. Detroit already received federal funds last year to invest in infrastructure for electric vehicles. Under the Biden administration, the city was focused on investing in this kind of infrastructure, but with President Trump in office, support for EV infrastructure is up in the air. Here to explain Detroit's efforts is the Deputy Chief of the Office of Mobility and Innovation for the city, Tony Giada. Tony, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. So first, can you explain what the city's plans are overall for electric vehicles?
Well, the city's overall plan for electric vehicles or EV charging in general is essentially just looking at the general landscape of what is necessary to be able to have a successful future. And we're not focusing on one element or another. We just want to ensure that everything kind of is working together. And some people talk about the chicken or the egg. How do you actually best start it off? Do you get electric vehicles out there and then the infrastructure, or vice versa? And what we've been adopting is like a balanced approach where from our perspective, we're looking at high traffic corridors and ensuring that we're placing them in locations where they are needed, and ensuring that we're building the partnerships between the city and local businesses to support this effort as we move forward to ensure that it is financially sustainable, a model for the future. And we just want to ensure that the network's built. We're expanding our internal fleet, but also we're promoting adoption by our residents to kind of balance out the whole approach from those. And one of the elements that gets less attention, which is also the electrical capacity of our grid. And we're also working very closely with DTE to ensure that the locations that are being selected are up to par. But in general, if I had to kind of sum it up, I would say we want to be able to get to a point where no one is living more than 3 to 5 miles away from an EV fast charger to be able to charge their vehicle, whether they're living in Detroit or commuting to Detroit.
And, Tony, the question, going from should we build the chargers and then they'll come, or should we give folks the option of getting these EV vehicles, hoping that we'll have the stations prepared? So when we talk about this and we think about this a little bit more, I think about myself, of course, someone who will probably most likely buy an EV vehicle soon, hopefully soon, but just thinking about the infrastructure here in the city of Detroit, but how it looks across the country. In what ways are you helping folks like myself who are interested one day very soon to buy an EV vehicle, but are still a little nervous about what we can expect going out of our city? Because it's one thing to have it in our city, to be around and driving around within the city of Detroit and Metro Detroit. But when we leave our cities, a lot of us are still a little nervous about that. So in what ways are you kind of helping us with that?
So I'm proud to say I'm an EV driver myself, and I do drive a long distance to work, and I do travel within the state itself. And it is a shift in the way that we envision our commute for sure. But in general, the goal is to try to reduce this range anxiety that may come up whenever you're driving. And the way that we're doing it is, first of all, we look at our city. This is the jurisdiction that we can operate under, but that does not prevent us from collaborating with the automakers, for one, to collaborate with them, especially that they're so Michigan focused, but also our counterparts at the state of Michigan, especially with the Office of Future Mobility and Electrification, who we've worked with very closely, and they have a number of different programs. But on the city side, we also want to ensure that whenever our 800 or so residents that do have EVs currently, and it's a growing number for sure, we are not causing any concern about where am I going to get that next charge, especially if you live in an apartment building where a charger is not easily accessible. And there's different layers of charging for sure. But then the other element to this is ensuring that Detroit is a very robust city and it attracts a lot of tourism, but also a lot of people commuting in for work. We want to ensure that that trip is not disrupted and it's actually as seamless as possible.
And Tony, the federal government has awarded Detroit twice to invest in EV infrastructure. Has work begun already? And if not, when do we expect to see that work beginning?
So there's a little bit of both. Right now, what we're focusing on is continuing with this deployment and with this installation of EV infrastructure. We have already a few locations that are already installed at some of our rec centers, but what we noticed is we need to start diversifying our portfolio when it comes to options for people that are actually charging and using EVs and being able to access this on their trips. And the way that it was done was looking at our network, our roadway network, and looking at where demand is actually happening, especially with the high traffic corridors that are coming in, and looking at the businesses that are available there that we can collaborate with, and looking at our grid. And by doing so, we're able to prioritize and maximize locations where they can be installed, and providing that this adoption that could happen within Detroit.
And Tony, just quickly about the chargers, because you are someone who actually drives a EV vehicle as well. Can you talk a little bit about the charging times and how many people do we expect the chargers to actually serve when they are up and running?
That's an excellent question. And typically, as some of us may know, and again, it's still an evolving realm that we're trying to kind of learn a little bit more about. So there's the regular plug in your wall, that's your 110 volts. There's a 240 volt level that can get you charged overnight, and that's what most people who charge at home do. But then there's the DC charging or the fast charging that is out there, and that comes in different levels. So within the city of Detroit, we're trying to aim for installing mostly fast chargers, because that's the one that allows for people to charge as they're going into the grocery store or being able to pick up their dinner for the day, and being able to kind of just like get that boost, 30 to 50 mile boost within that 20 minutes that you're stopping in there. Again, these numbers vary vastly, and what we're trying to shoot for is also installing those in locations where there's available parking for those EVs, and ensuring that what we're aiming for is about 4 locations, 4 spots per location, so that there's that abundance of locations and people are not blocked from being able to charge.
And how do you determine the best location of chargers, especially when we talk about the city of Detroit? You hinted at it a little bit with DTE, collabing with them to see where the power grid could handle such charging stations. So, how do you determine the best location in Detroit?
So that has been the billion-dollar question, and there's always hindsight, and there's always going to be some review of this. But our team has worked diligently with our internal departments, with external stakeholders and partners, to ensure that we're doing it right and we're delivering on this entrusted number of funds in the correct fashion. And the way that, again, we looked at the high traffic corridors, ensuring that the volumes are being met, ensuring that the businesses are willing to work with us, because we need the place to be able to install those. And ideally, you want them outside of the roadway parking or on the edge of the road, which in some locations there will be, but mostly they're going to be at businesses right on those corridors. And then being able to ensure that we're working very closely with DTE to increase the electrical grid capacity in that location to be able to accommodate this charging and be able to ensure that it is fast charging, and always communicating as well with the neighborhoods and with our residents. That's super important to ensure that we're doing it the right way and people are understanding what are the benefits and what are the the possibilities that exist within that, and we are investing into that as well through public engagement, and other ways of communication.
You're listening to the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're talking with Tony Giada about support for electric vehicles. He's the Deputy Chief of the Office of Mobility Innovation for the City of Detroit. Tony, when we're talking about these chargers, it makes me think about the optics of them. I think about a parking garage that I use downtown, and I notice that the spots with chargers are some of the prime spots in this parking garage. Do you expect these chargers to inspire more people to buy electric vehicles? Is that part of the goal?
So definitely, and this is the chicken or egg type of approach of things. I would say inspire is maybe one way of looking at it, and maybe also seeing the opportunity that comes within those EVs. They're out there. They're being promoted for a reason. The biggest one is the environmental sustainability and the opportunities that they bring in terms of air quality, especially in dense cities and growing cities such as ours, and ensuring that we are using potentially more and more sustainable and renewable sources to be able to charge those vehicles. So the idea is we want to promote those and we want to provide those, but you can't expect a Detroiter to come and buy an electric vehicle without having frequent access to those chargers. So this is where the fine balance kind of exists. And if you're a person that goes to work and parks in the parking garage, it makes it very easy because that's somewhere that you can put your vehicle while you're at work. Whereas, jobs come in different shapes, sizes, and forms. And we want to be able to try to accommodate those different variations. And this is what Detroit does so well. Like, we have been innovators within the mobility field, and this is no longer just the auto field. We greatly support the vehicles, but there's so many different types of vehicles out there in our day and age right now. But the idea is we want to ensure that there are no barriers for someone to be able to access this, so that anyone can equitably get a vehicle and be equitably reach a charger to be able to achieve the benefits that it provides.
Yeah, Tony, let's talk a little bit more about accessibility and the fact that there are a lot of folks who are not going to be able to buy an electric vehicle. So let's look actually at buses that folks might be using. In May 2022, the city received 4 electric buses as part of a pilot program. So I'm wondering if there are any updates with that, if there could be more electrified transit in the future.
Absolutely. And I'd like to maybe share the good news that we have learned so much from that experience. So it's been about 2 years, a little over 2 years since we got those. And it's one thing just buying the new shiny object or the new shiny technology and just saying, hey, it's going to solve all my problems. But then there's the other part about figuring out how does it best serve your purpose and be able to refine that and even get our local departments and employees ready for this, and getting the public also ready for this as well. So the buses are a huge success, and we're continuing to grow. So we have a number of them that are coming in as well. But we're also looking at the different variations of what the electrification brings in. So it's not always about just fully electric. There could be low and no emission solutions out there. So we have 26 hybrid buses that are coming in to the city of Detroit in the next few months. And that will also significantly contribute towards that, and the lessons learned from that are huge. But then there's also the idea of hydrogen buses that we're also have on order, and we will be kind of working with. So what we're trying to do is diversify our portfolio, make sure that we're learning from whatever's out there, and ensuring that, again, the learning is internal to our departments, but also external to our partners that we work with. So it's whether there's the mechanic that we collaborate with, the OEMs, or any other company or user that uses the system.
Tony, you said 26 hybrid buses. That has me curious about how many buses overall are in the city's fleet. How much does that really make a dent?
So it is a significant number. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I believe it's a little over. Again, I don't want to give the exact number. I'm not 100% sure, but it is a significant number. So between the electric buses, the hydrogen, the new electric buses that are coming in, and the hybrid buses, I would say we're probably looking at potentially over 30% of our fleet. But the interesting thing is that the city has also gone beyond buses. So, for example, our parking enforcement fleet, about 48 vehicles are completely electric. And they have their own electric chargers out there, and they operate within the city of Detroit, and they've been in operation for over 2 years now. And that has been a super successful program to show how a city department can adopt electrification successfully with the barriers that we have within Detroit. So we know the temperature today, we've seen the snow, all of that impacts the performance of an electric vehicle, and we've successfully been able to prove that concept. And not only that, we've employed it. So we have no internal combustion engine vehicles with our parking. So continuing to try, work, improve, and then continue that process is definitely something we've been working on over the last few years, of course, in close collaboration with federal funding and state partnerships.
Now, the city of Detroit is set to elect a new mayor this year. I'm wondering how this could impact this trajectory, this hopeful trajectory that you have been outlining when it comes to increasing electric vehicle infrastructure.
That is a great question, and we all watched the inauguration last night on the federal side of things. And by the end of the year, we have a new election for mayor. I'd like to believe that as humans, we like to always look at innovating, improving, and improving the quality of our lives one way or another. And I think the administration element of things is only coming into there's always ways to kind of work to improve the quality of what's out there. But from our perspective, we have some systems that have proven to work. And if we're always focusing on what is the value that this is bringing to our residents, to our city, and to our nation, we should be able to justify expanding and building upon some of those elements. So we are very much looking forward to working with the new administration, whether on a federal level or on a local level, and ensuring that we show the quality, the lessons learned, the successes, and maybe the elements that we need to improve upon within some of those deployments, and work collaboratively to choose the best way forward with what's going on.
But Tony, if I could jump in, what is Plan B if President Trump eliminates support for projects like this? How does that impact the city's long-term plans? How do you continue to move forward if that's the case?
So for the time being, the investments that we have are pretty much covered in terms of deployment. What we're trying to do is we're trying to diversify the portfolio, as I had mentioned earlier, to ensure that there's sustainability of the program. And one way of doing that is through partnerships with businesses and ensuring that this is not only a federally funded effort, this is a shift in the way that we're seeing things for the benefit of society, for the benefit of air quality, et cetera, et cetera. So the way that we're approaching it is by bringing everyone to the table and making sure that the conversation is still moving forward. And I still have hope that the new administration will see the benefit of what is being put out there, because we have gotten to a point where not only have we tested it, but we've proven that it is successful on an actual working basis. So I'm very hopeful in what could come out of that.
Tony Giada is the Deputy Chief of the Office of Mobility Innovation for the City of Detroit. Tony, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you for having me. Go Lions.
The Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. From the WDET Newsroom, public schools in Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb County are closed today because of the cold weather. Many districts will be shut down again tomorrow, after which temperatures are supposed to rise. Eastern Michigan, Lawrence Tech, and Oakland universities are closed, along with Schoolcraft College's campus in Livonia, Wayne State University is operating remotely, and Detroit community centers and public library branches will serve as warming centers during normal business hours. The same goes for Royal Oak. You'll see the same thing happening in Taylor and a few other places as well, so do check with your city. And tips: dress in layers, limit outdoor exposure as much as possible, check on your neighbors, especially the elderly, and bring in your pets if you have outdoor pets.
Up next, we'll hear from Detroit native and filmmaker Lawrence Lamont. His new comedy, One of Them Days, just debuted at #1 at the box office.
We'll be right back on the Metro. Stay right there.
Welcome back to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. And, sitting across from my buddy right now, One of Them Days, It's a buddy comedy. And it's featuring Keke Palmer and singer Zizza. The two best friends go on a journey to find rent money or face eviction. Okay. The story is one that's common. Two women embark on an epic journey that seemingly starts out innocent and often leads to self-discovery for one or both characters. But One of Them Days is no different in terms of the adventures the women are thrust into. But it is unique because it features two Black women. And the fact that was important. That was a fact that was important to the director of the film, Lawrence Lamont. Lawrence is a Detroit native, and he wanted to tell this buddy comedy story based on his experience growing up in the city.
And Tia, as you know, Lamont isn't new to the game, but as a filmmaker, his name might be new to some. He directed the award-winning music video I Don't for Detroit rapper Big Sean. He also directed several episodes of Issa Rae's show, we'll call it Rap-ish, on Max. Lawrence Lamont directed One of Them Days as well. He sat down with you, Tia, to discuss Michigan's film incentives, being prepared for the moment, and how Detroit influenced his love for writing. You all started off by talking about, of course, your signature question, Tia, what part of the city he's from.
I grew up on the east side more so, McDonald Square, Ralph Bunche Homes, but I'm a hybrid. I like to say I grew up on all parts because, it takes a village to raise any kid. And I had granddad on the west side, I'm on the west side. I went to high school in Southfield, went to Southfield High. So I was all over the place. I'm I'm really a Detroit hybrid, truly.
All right, yeah.
But I claim the east side, 48207.
I'm a west sider myself, and I just moved to the east side. I'm getting used to it, truly. I always joke with people, Detroit, east and west. We want to bring them together, of course, but they are truly different spaces sometimes. It's interesting.
It is.
It's really interesting to experience.
They could be two different cities. I always tell people Detroit and a whole is a country.
It is. And sometimes you never know what you're going to be a part of when you're in the city of Detroit. But, getting into your background a little bit more, you're from the city of Detroit. And we have a rich arts and culture history here. When did you decide that you wanted to write and direct?
Kind of at a young age. I started writing really young. I wrote a book when I was 10 years old for a school project. And, I didn't really know what directing was yet, but I was infatuated with films. I would love to stay into the end and watch the credits. I had an aunt that used to record everything on VHS, literally everything. And the endings would get cut off sometimes, so I would create my own endings. And then when I got to high school, I joined theater. I was acting when I was younger too, but I joined theater at Southfield High, and my drama teacher, Brenda Perriman, RIP, she basically instilled excellence, so it was the first time I really realized what a director is and what classic cinema really feels like. And I had friends around the time I was finishing high school that were musicians, and they needed music videos, and around this time it was the digital wave was happening with cameras. So I had friends with digital cameras, and they needed music videos, and I'm like, you know what? I'll direct it. I'll write a treatment and direct it. And my first time on set, I was just it was that voila, aha, this is what I need to be doing. I'm dedicating the rest of my life to doing this nonstop. So
Yeah, I love that so much. One of my questions actually was going to be about your big aha or big break moment, so to say. What was it like with that first video, being on that first video set?
I mean, the first music video set was for a dear friend, and I was maybe like 19 when I directed it. And that's when I think I had my aha moment of being behind the camera and like building this world. I kind of knew like there's something here, you know. I would say my big break would be a video I directed for Big Sean, called "I Don't F With You." You may or may not have heard that song before.
I mean, instant classic.
That was like nominated for Video of the Year. It got like hundreds of millions of views, and I think my style really like started shining through with that because the way I would approach music videos would be like mini movies. I always heard like it's tough being a music video director transitioning into TV or film. So I'm like, if that's the case, I'm gonna make sure that everything is elevated. We're doing things outside of the box. I'm making. If you're a rapper, you acting in this video. You know what I mean? So I would say that was my big break. But I always just felt like I knew I was in my sacred calling. Though I will say that.
So you got your feet wet. You started to see how storytelling can unfold when you're producing and directing a music video. But let's talk about the city of Detroit, the state of Michigan, those film incentives that we once had. We saw lots of big budget films shot here in the city of Detroit and southeastern Michigan. And then we saw it taken away, and we saw that the film industry pull out of the state. So let's talk about what the film incentives would do or bring back to the city of Detroit, state of Michigan as a whole. But then as well, let's dive into Tubi and the universe that Tubi is, because Tubi has really allowed Detroiters to take power into their own hands when we talk about the film industry and telling their own stories.
I mean, I think you can compare it to a city like Atlanta, and just see that the resurgence would happen down there with their programs. So many people are moving there to join, be in crews, to be in movies. So I think it could be Atlanta, but with even greater chances to do more because in the state of Michigan, you can do any settings. You can do a desert. You can treat one of the Great Lakes like an ocean. You can go into the inner city. It's like so many elements. And I do wish the incentives were back because this is a beautiful place, and what it will do for the economy is just look at Atlanta, look at Louisiana. So many places that you see it thriving. And I love the Tubi film. I produced the film and starred in the film called Corner Store a long time ago. Don't look it up. Almost 15 years ago, which is crazy to even say. I love it. It just shows Detroiters are hustling and are going to make something. And I always tell filmmakers, aspiring filmmakers, like, make something, man. Like, even if you don't have a budget, just go do it. So I love the To Be scene. I love all the indie stuff that's happening here, but I do think that with the incentives back, we can bring big motion pictures here, big studios, network shows. I have a lot of ideas. It's funny, most of my ideas that I want to do that I created are set in Detroit. And I'm like so firm on like not shooting it anywhere else, like, here's this Detroit story, but let's go to Minneapolis and make it happen. It's just like it's not authentic, so it would be tough. But I love the scene. I think it can only get better. There's so much talent here, and there's so much undiscovered talent here too.
And that's the thing. I'm really tapped into the arts and culture scene right now, especially here at WDET. And a thing that I've noticed about the city of Detroit, especially just covering the scene, is every day, every single week, I'm finding a new director or a new writer, a new poet, a new artist, a new musician. And I'm just like, number one, where did y'all come from? Who's this? Who's that? These painters,
everything.
Sculptors. I mean, it's making my mind spin to see so much talent coming out of the city of Detroit from all ages. So you're not based here anymore. Where are you based now?
Oh, yeah. I've been living in LA for 12 years. I had to, it was kind of around the time the incentives left. And I'm like, it's either LA or New York. Atlanta wasn't even what it has become. But I've been in LA for 12 years, but this is my home too, and I'm just waiting on some projects or something so I can come be here full time even.
And when you say that, I know so many folks who've moved out of the city of Detroit due to the film industry being in other spaces and places. My good friend has moved to Atlanta. She's been there for about 4 years now, and she's been working in the industry nonstop for these past 4 years. So I just want to know, in what way do you see Detroit becoming that again?
We had a bill that was created, but they just voted against it. So
it's a national production, of course. Your producer is Issa Rae. But I think about people seeing the heights that you're reaching and have reached so far. They want to know how to get there, too. They want to know how to get their break or get their foot in the door. So when you see people of color, Black people, or all people, honestly, interested in the industry, what are some of the first steps or what are some of the first things that you're telling people? Because I know it's not the same for every single person. Sometimes it's just about being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah. Everybody's path is completely different. I would say the first step is don't compare yourself to anybody, because we all are individuals, and what's written for us it's not going to look the same as the next person. Also, I would just say, perseverance is key. It's key. If you really feel like you are in your destiny trying to make your film or your show, don't quit, because that's like the only way you can lose is if you stop. Breaks come young, old. We know actors who didn't get their breaks here in their 50s, directors, all sorts of things. So I would just say just the perseverance is key, and just make something. That's what I was just mentioning too, which is why I respect all the Detroit films happening, the indie films happening here, because people are just making stuff. It's nothing better you can do than just make something. You're gonna learn. You can, even if you got to be all the departments. That's been me before. You know what I mean? So don't give up. And anything can happen, literally.
I'm sorry. I had to get a jump from Shamika, and they had a checkpoint in LaBrea. I had to go all the way around.
And going back to the film, One of Them Days, starring Keke Palmer and ZZA, and I think about, both of them being that girl. They're the it girls right now, both powerhouse Black women working together.
Don't forget, I have my interview at 4. Why are you still trying to be in corporate? Do your own thing. And what's that? Living paycheck to paycheck? You got this, okay? You been that girl. Been that girl. That my best friend. She a real.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance of having a story tell the buddy comedy or have that buddy comedy feel with two Black women? Because it's something that we don't often see.
Well, I wanted it to not be an anomaly, because why is this rare? Why is this like the second Black woman buddy comedy ever? Like, what are we even doing? Let alone just an original story. So I want people to see that you can do an original story and have success, and it can, connect to audiences just like IP or sequels and trilogies. And also I just want people to, leave the theater just I've had a good time and hopeful,
If we don't get the rent money by 6, we're going to be on a curb with Fabian.
You want to buy my grandma's vintage speaker?
And your grandma just died. She ain't even in the ground yet.
I think this story is about friendship, it's about community, and it's about hope, and which are back against the wall and everything it looks like it's going to hell, like you never know what can happen,
If I get this job, you and me going to be good. For real. You don't have to live like this anymore. You got this.
And I think it's important to have this story being told, especially because, number one, anyone can relate to the idea of having a ride or die or having someone who has your back no matter what. You can call them for any reason and they will be there for you. Anyone can relate to that. But just adding on to it, the Black sisterhood of it all and telling that story and telling this ride or die story through the lens of Black women is absolutely amazing.
And I just want people to have fun, the world needs to laugh right now. And I think this film is a good testament of, how sticking together and laughing together is healing.
We getting a white person in the jungle.
I am right here if you guys ever want to have a girls' night. A little Prosecco and pals.
Child, I saw one with a cat in a stroller.
Mama Ruth.
That was Lawrence Lamond, a Detroit native and the director of One of Them Days, which is out now in theaters nationwide, and currently it's the #1 movie in the country.
From from the WDET newsroom. This week, the city of Detroit will mail new assessments to property owners. Mayor Duggan's office says the average home value rose 20% in 2024, gaining almost $1.5 billion. That puts the total value of all residential property in the city at roughly $10 billion for the first time since the housing bubble burst in 2008. Now, a constitutional cap is supposed to protect homeowners from large tax increases if they bought their homes before last year. Investigations by the Detroit News and other local outlets found the city overassessed properties by more than $600 million. That was between 2012 and 2016.
Coming up at 11, Americans have been paying more for energy since the 1970s. Electricity rates in particular have been increasing. And so, in the next hour, we want to understand why that's happening and what it would look like to transition to clean energy sources. As well, coming up next, change of mood here. What happened to the Lions? What happened to Jared Goff? Why did he throw so many interceptions? The world may never know. We'll hash it out next.
These are the questions that plague the entire city of Detroit and beyond right now. It's the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. Stay with us. Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. And the Lions were more than dominant this year. Their offense was nearly unstoppable, and their defense battled through broken bones and season-ending injuries to do just enough. But on Saturday, this past Saturday, their dominant season came to a sad, grinding halt. The Lions lost to the Washington Commanders 45-31 at Ford Field. Jared Goff had a horrible game. Robin, a horrible game.
I mean, I'm just looking forward to not hearing Jared Goff chants at Little Caesars Arena when the Pistons are playing. Let's show some respect.
We'll never hear it. I won't say never, but we won't hear it anytime soon, that's for sure. And the defense couldn't stop the Commanders' rookie quarterback, Jaden Daniels, who was just putting on a show. To top it all off, Lions offensive coordinator Ben Johnson is officially going to the Bears. And defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn has interviews with the Jets and the Saints this week. Here to walk us through the final chapter of the Lions season and to look ahead to next year is Detroit Free Press sports columnist Sean Windsor. Sean, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro today.
Oh, good to be with you guys. It's been a bit.
It's been a little bit. I believe we spoke at the beginning of the Lions season. Now here we are. How are you feeling about that loss now that we've had a couple days to process it?
It was, you're right. I was just listening to kind of how you were laying it out there, and it's hard to argue with any of it, especially the fact that maybe we won't have to hear those chants at Little Caesars Arena. And by the way, it wasn't just for Pistons game. It was for Red Wings games.
Yeah.
And, and frankly, God, you remember last year, they would break out in a pharmacy or a grocery store. It was just maybe it was endearing for a minute or two, a second or two maybe, but that's one good thing. Shoot, when Jaden Ivey, the Pistons' young, promising shooting guard, broke his leg and was down on the court, the part of the fan base was chanting Jared Goff while he was laid out on the floor, and so that was probably that needed to stop.
Yes, it did. And, Robin's been the one who's been the leader in that charge there at WDET, just making those chants stop.
No more.
Just no more. But Sean, the Lions were heavily favored to win the game, and but they lost on both sides of the ball. Let's start with the defense. Now, we knew the defense was already banged up. They started the game with 13 defensive players injured. That's 13, and 6 of them starters. Even though the defense was missing so many key players, they've been able to piece together and get some stops when needed all year. What happened?
Well, it's funny because the last regular season game of the year when they secured the number 1 seed, they beat the Minnesota Vikings on a Sunday night. A couple of weeks ago, their quarterback, Sam Darnold, he's a traditional sort of pocket passer. He doesn't move very well, and it was set up better for the Lions defense in the state that they are. And it was a bit of a mirage. And, I think they held the Vikings to 9 points that night. But if you look in the last 5 or 6 weeks, the defense had been struggling. They gave up, so I'm trying to remember how many points at San Francisco, but Brock Purdy, their quarterback, had a night. Caleb Williams, the young rookie who struggled in Chicago, new home of the offensive coordinator, Ben Johnson, he had a game against the Lions. Obviously, Josh Allen in here a month ago with the Buffalo Bills. Yeah. That led an offense that scored 40-some points. So it had been trending that way. There were just too many injuries. I think Aleem McNeil, their great defensive tackle up front, was hurt and tore his ACL against the Bills game. So that Minnesota game, I think, gave folks around here a little bit of a false sense of hope on the defensive side. And Jaden Daniels, as you mentioned, is just, he's 24 going on 34 and a terrific, terrific young talent with a lot of poise and a lot of calm, and he moves just so fluidly and effortlessly, and the Lions had nothing for him. They couldn't pressure him, and the injuries just got him. So I think what we saw, to sort of sum it up, is kind of what we've been seeing, except for that one game. And the offense was going to have to be perfect to beat them in the state that the defense was in.
Speaking of the offense, Jahmyr Gibbs had a great game with 175 yards, 2 touchdowns, doing the normal Gibbs thing. But Jared Goff, I was watching the game with a bunch of people, and that was just the one thing that I kept pointing out to folks. Like, he does not look like what we're used to seeing him throughout the entire season. This is probably the worst we've seen him all year. He fumbled. He threw 3 interceptions, one of which was a pick 6. Is the Commanders' defense that good, or was Goff just off?
I think he was off, and I think there are a couple thoughts I have with Goff and the offense. Well, first of all, on the second, when they were up 7-3 and they're moving the ball again, and they were down inside, I don't know, somewhere near the 20 of the Commanders, and looked like they were going to, get to a 14-3 lead, and it was 3rd and 1, and he drops back, and Amon-Ra St. Brown stumbles in the route, so Goff can't get to him. And he steps up, and that gives the defensive line of the Commanders just another second. And they get to him, and it's a strip sack fumble. And that moment, if the defense is what it had been early in the season, then maybe they force a punt there. And it's not that big a deal. But because of the compromised defense, and Washington goes down and scores and takes the lead 10-7, I think from that moment on, Goff started pressing. But not just Goff, the whole team. And that leads to my other thought. I felt like, I don't know if it was the bye week, the number 1 seed, the expectations. Last year in the playoffs, they were playing with house money. It was a joyful ride. They'd been making history relative to their franchise, the first playoff win in 33 years or something like that. And it just all felt like this sort of magical thing. This year, there was a different kind of pressure. And I hate to say this, but I think it got to him. And I think once it went awry, even just that fumble, a team that's normally been so resilient, they started pressing, and it just kind of got away from him. And I think Goff more than anybody felt that, which is why he, tried to force the ball down the field on the pick 6. Normally he would check down. He had a running back open. And he was doing things that were uncharacteristic of him. And then he got concussed and didn't look the same at all. Well, not concussed, but he got hit pretty hard and did not look the same at all.
I mean, Sean, is it possible that he was playing concussed, maybe? I mean, he sustained an injury to the head and neck area that seemed pretty serious.
It did, and he looked a little wobbly, and they went and took him into the medical team and checked him out. Who knows? I mean, they can't do a scan right there, and I know that that's not really always how they determine that, but it's certainly possible. He did not look the same after that. I didn't think he looked quite the same before that, though. Like I said, after that fumble, I don't know. Maybe sometimes a team there was so much anticipation and pressure. And look, and these athletes are used to dealing with lots of things, but sometimes you got to get up and get through something to kind of understand it. And Dan Campbell talked about this yesterday. He said he didn't have the guys ready, and he didn't feel like he prepared them properly, and they just were a little bit off, maybe from the start, and they just couldn't. That's a lesson for him. He's going to spend the offseason trying to figure out, okay, what do I do differently the next time we get into that spot?
Sean, I wonder, do you think the question is when the Lions needed Goff at his best? Is it fair for Lions fans to ask, is Goff the guy?
I mean, it's fair for them to ask. I think he is, just because of how well he's played in so many big moments through the regular season. I know it's not the playoffs. Last year, he played in 3 playoff games, and it was great. He didn't have a turnover in 3 games, and they were, a play or two away from the Super Bowl. If Josh Reynolds catches that pass on 4th down, maybe they were in the Super Bowl. And who knows at that point? Kansas City wasn't dominant last year. Maybe they actually win the Super Bowl, and the conversation is different. But the way he played last year in the playoffs, the way he played to help get the team to the number 1 seed, even Saturday night, it was the decision making on that. After the fumble, if that doesn't happen, maybe he gets into the rhythm. He did throw some awfully nice passes. They had almost 500 yards of offense and scored 31 points. It's funny we're talking about how bad he was, and he was, but it's relative, right? This team, the Lions are built to be in balance. Offensively, run the pass, overall, offense to defense. And so many of those injuries just sort of threw the balance off. And by the end, the offense, I think, felt a little bit too much pressure.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham, and we're chatting with Detroit Free Press columnist Sean Windsor as we decompress the Lions' loss on Saturday and what to expect going forward. So you do have a column out this morning about Ben Johnson, that is, the offensive coordinator, leaving to be with the Bears to be the new head coach. The Lions really have a good thing going here, and he played such an important role in the turnaround. But head coaching opportunities don't grow on trees, of course. So what do you think of this? Is Ben Johnson making the right choice? And what can the Bears expect?
Well, I tried to have a little fun in that column, saying basically, I didn't use the word traitor, but that's how a lot of fans are feeling, right? So I was like, hey, he's choosing the Chicago dog, and it's fluorescent green relish over our chili at Lafayette. That's not cool. So, and can't you see that Detroit is a superior city in every way? We're just having fun, but no, it's tough for. I think it's tough for. First of all, I think it's tough for Lions fans because now they got to see him twice a year with a divisional rival, and they've got I mentioned Caleb Williams earlier. They've got a talented young quarterback, and the work that Ben Johnson did with Jared Goff suggests that he's probably got a chance to do some special things with him. So I think that feels a little uneasy for a lot of folks around here. We'll see though. There's a lot more to run in the team than putting together a playbook, right? An offensive playbook. Yeah. If Aaron Glenn, the defensive coordinator, leaves, and this may be a hot take, or I may be in the minority of this, I think they'll have a harder time replacing him. Just the way he carries himself and what he kind of oozes out of his pores. You ever listen to Aaron Glenn speak? He's got that voice. He's a shorter Dan Campbell. Right?
And Sean, really quickly, if we do see Aaron Glenn leaving, defensive coordinator for the Lions, are there any names that have popped up as prospects yet?
Well, you could maybe see for Glenn, Kelvin Shepard, the linebackers coach. Dan Campbell likes him a lot. The team really responds to him. He's been given a little bit more responsibilities this year in terms of addressing the team when it's not just the linebacker room, but the whole team. Campbell's really been great about that. He wants his guys to get more responsibility because they want to pursue the careers that they want. And to me, that's why he'll always attract. It's one of the reasons he'll always attract coaches. But I can see Kelvin Shepard on the defensive side. Campbell told us yesterday when he kind of did the season wrap up that he'll look outside too. It's not just inside. He's going to look outside. But they got a lot of talented young guys on the staff. So that's not to say that they won't miss Glenn and Johnson if Glenn does go. Of course they will. And Johnson was really, really good. I'll be curious to see what kind of a head coach he is, though. How he commands the room, how he talks to the media. All this kind of stuff matters.
And 30 seconds or less, what are you keeping an eye on this season, off season? Who they keep among their free agents, who they bring in. Obviously, about a third. Most years, about a third of a roster of an NFL team turns over, so there are going to be a lot of new faces. Just kind of see what they can do to bolster the defensive line. Do they get a little bit more speed in the linebacking areas? And can they keep the offensive
kind of core together. But just, the draft will be interesting. Brad Holmes has proven to be an expert drafter. But, just how the team changes and who they bring in and what areas on the field.
Sean Windsor is a sports columnist for the Detroit Free Press. Sean, thank you so much for breaking that down for us, and we will chat with you soon.
Call anytime. It's always my pleasure.
Coming up at 11, Americans have been paying more for energy since the 1970s. Electricity rates, in particular, have been increasing. And so in the next hour, we want to understand why that's happening and what it would look like to transition to clean energy sources. And we also want to hear from you. Are you paying too much for the energy you use? Call in and tell us. The number is 313-577-1019.
It's the Metro on WDET. Stay with us.
This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.
Metro on WDET. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. And this polar vortex has us asking the question, why have utility companies across the country been charging more for energy? Since the 1970s, our energy bills have been going up year after year. Utility companies like DTE have been asking for rate hikes. But it's not just them. Utilities nationwide have been raising rates. The increasing energy costs come at an interesting time in our country's history. That's because many companies, states, and organizations are trying to switch to clean energy sources. That's true of our electrical utilities, too. Now the state of Michigan is tasked with operating only on clean energy sources by 2040. And that matters because utility companies provide so much of the energy we use, and they run mostly on natural gas.
And Robin, we are asking our folks, what do you know? What do you want to know? What would it look like to make them run on renewable energy like solar and wind power? And how can we bring down the cost of our energy? This hour, we want to know, are you paying too much for the energy you use? Give us a call, 313-577-1019. These utilities we're referring to, they're often private or investor owned. And we want to know, how is the political structure of our utilities impacting our bills? Is it driving up the cost of energy? To help us understand that, we have Richard Hirsch here. He's a professor of history at Virginia Tech and the author of multiple books on American utilities. Professor Hirsch, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro. And just a heads up to those listening, the Metro invited DTE onto the show to participate in the conversation. They said they may get back with us in time to join later in the hour. But once again, Professor Hirsch, welcome to the Metro.
Well, thank you very much, Tia and Robin. It's great to be with you.
Yes. So utility companies came onto the scene in the late 1800s, but they really expanded in the 1920s. Why did so many electrical utility companies grow so fast? What was happening during that time in our country's electrical history?
Okay. Well, the history of electricity or electric power utilities really started in the 1880s or so. Thomas Edison built a power plant in New York City that provided electricity for neighboring or nearby businesses. It was it was a business that started off slowly, but it became very popular as electric lighting and electric motors and other equipment that could use electricity became really productive and helped make life so much better. Electric lights were a godsend. They were amazing forms of illumination compared to other forms of illumination that required combustion, in other words, fire. It was very dangerous. But the use of electric motors in homes for fans, in electric motors in factories really boosted productivity, and electrification became a big deal. It became a big business. There were a bunch of companies that would produce electricity in each city. And by the early 1900s, you started seeing electricity making its way into people's homes in greater and greater numbers, such that by the mid-1920s or so, people living in homes in cities were largely electrified. 60-70% of homes had electricity then. Electricity was being produced at first by several companies, but companies and managers realized that they could take advantage of improving technology to consolidate their companies and produce electricity at lower cost.
Professor Hirsch,
yes.
Really quickly, so would you say this is why electricity became a utility operated by companies instead of other utilities like water?
Well, there were often companies that like gas companies that got into electricity, but water was a different type of utility. But yes, by the early 20th century, the electricity business was viewed as a utility, something that provided a commodity or service that was really important to everyday life. And yes, it became viewed as a utility and ultimately as a natural monopoly utility, which is something I think you want to talk about at some point.
Yes, eventually, Professor Hirsch. But, why was it viewed as a commodity?
Well, it was both a commodity and a service. Yeah. Electricity is basically electrons that are flowing through wires into people's homes and businesses. And it was a commodity in the sense that it's produced in large quantities, but it can be perhaps better viewed as a service because electricity can be used to do so many things. And it's an incredibly versatile commodity in the sense that with electricity, you can heat things up, you can cool things down, you can cook with it, you can illuminate with it, you can provide motion with it through electric motors. It is a secondary source of energy in the sense that electricity is made usually by burning some other type of fuel, such as coal, natural gas, petroleum, and more recently using renewable energy resources. Anything that can produce motion, even hydroelectric sources of power, anything that produces motion that can turn a generator that makes electricity. That's the more traditional form. Again, renewable energy resources such as wind and solar, or solar in particular, do things a bit differently.
And Professor Hirsch, honestly, I find it so fascinating because you talked about how quickly homes started to see electricity, fully electric homes. And it seemed like it was just a very quick time. So people were transitioning and adjusting very, very quickly. And, how did we come to this space where so many of our electrical utilities became investor-owned or publicly traded companies? What was the benefit of that setup?
Well, if you think about the 1880s into the early 20th century, during the progressive era of American politics, you had private businesses that provided services, not necessarily government organizations, like you see in other countries. So you had private companies that were producing electricity and selling it in a competitive marketplace at first. And that made some sense, to be sure. But in the late 1890s, early 20th century, there were different forms of utilities. In other words, there were different ways for organizing the electric power business. You had private utility companies, and you also had municipally owned utility companies. In other words, companies owned by cities. The cities would produce the electricity themselves and sell electricity to its customers, which were the taxpayers. And in theory, the municipal model made some sense because whatever profits there may have been would be fed back into the business itself, and it would pay for, the profits would pay for new equipment and better service and so on. But that model didn't necessarily become the predominant model. And even today, only about 15% of electricity is sold by municipal utilities. Private utilities were able to become more prominent because they were able to expand their borders outside of just cities. They were able to have more customers and exploit economies of scale with technologies that incrementally improved, such that the cost of electricity on a per unit basis declined almost annually from the 1800s into the 1960s. And these private companies were able to consolidate and become monopolies, and then they became viewed as natural monopolies, meaning they were businesses that operated best as single non-competitive companies, but that's when you see regulation coming in as well in the early 20th century.
Professor Hirsch, you write that this was not inevitable, that decentralized businesses could have come to control most of our electrical utilities. Why do you think that couldn't come to be in our country?
Well, it was the case for businesses in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th centuries. The notion of distributed generation, or having a business produce its own electricity, was quite common in the early years of the industry. There were companies that would produce a lot of heat, for example, for themselves. They needed it for industrial processes. They could use the same boilers, for example, heating mechanisms to produce motion in generators that would produce, or that did produce, electricity for their own businesses. And it was quite common until around the 19-teens, when the privately owned, investor-owned utilities were able to produce electricity cheaper and more efficiently than the businesses could themselves. So this distributed generation model lost favor in the early 20th century. And utilities did offer other benefits too. For example, they would interconnect. Starting in the 19-teens and 1920s, they interconnected with other utilities across boundaries, such that if one utility company had a power plant that went out and it was short of electricity, it could depend on a utility that was interconnected with it to provide backup services. So it turned out that this interconnected utility system provided some efficiency benefits and also cost benefits to utilities and their customers.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET Detroit Public Radio. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're speaking with Richard Hirsch. He's a professor of history at Virginia Tech. We're talking about why our electrical utilities are often designed as publicly traded companies. We also want to hear from you. Are you paying too much for the energy you use right now? Call in and tell us, 313-577-1019. And Professor Hirsch, We know people are paying a lot for energy right now, and it continues to go up, but that wasn't always the case. You've discussed that, how from the 1880s until the 1970s, electrical companies were bringing down their rates by as much as 90%. So talk a little bit more about how they were able to do that and what changed exactly in the 1970s.
Sure. The industry was able to take advantage of incrementally improving technologies. In particular, it came up with the industry exploited steam turbine technologies that demonstrated great economies of scale. So as these turbines that turned generators that made electricity got bigger and bigger, they were able to lower the incremental and marginal cost of electricity. In other words, as these generators and turbines got bigger, the unit cost, the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity declined. And regulatory commissions allowed utility companies to charge less or lower and lower rates for electricity. And as you pointed out, between the 1880s and 1970, the real inflation-adjusted price of electricity declined 95+%. It was amazing in a sense because even though there was a lot of inflation in that period, the cost of electricity declined, and people therefore used electricity pretty much without thinking much about it, certainly not thinking about how to use it most efficiently. By the 1970s, there were some technological problems and management problems that caused the cost of electricity to flatten out. It wouldn't go down much anymore, and in the 1970s, you start seeing the electricity price going up, and in fact, dramatically, especially after 1973.
Professor Hirsch, if I could
Yes.
jump in here, when you
Sure.
say technological problems, management problems, as briefly as you can, what were those?
Okay, so there were problems there were metallurgical problems, for example. Managers were trying to increase the scale of power plants and
Metallurgical?
Yes. So with these turbines, for example, they tried to make them bigger to take advantage of even more economies of scale. But the turbine blades, for example, got so long that they were encountering physical problems. These turbines were reaching limits to growth. The metallurgy couldn't handle at the time the increased steam temperatures, for example, that were being used to try to eke out the extra % or two of efficiency from these turbines. And what one sees is that during the 1970s, the power, these turbines and generators just couldn't get bigger. They tried building bigger units, but they were uneconomic. They weren't efficient. They were having lots of problems. So you started seeing the increases in scale not diminishing, but they were flattening out. And then because you couldn't eke out more efficiencies, the industry was affected by the increasing cost of fuel.
So basically a supply and demand problem was ensuing here.
Well, I'm not so sure it was supply and demand. It was more that the technology was no longer able to deliver decreased costs.
Okay.
The demand for electricity was increasing. It was increasing typically after World War II at about a rate of 7% per year. And that may not sound like a lot, but it means every 10 years, people are doubling their demand for electricity. And the power companies were unable to build bigger and bigger units in the 1970s. But a bigger factor here was the cost of fuel after the energy crisis starting in 1973. So between October 1973 and January of 1974, the cost of oil, which was used for a lot of electricity generation, quadrupled in price. And you would imagine, you would understand rather, that the cost of energy is a big cost of making electricity. And if the fuel cost goes up a lot, then the cost goes up and then the price has to go up. And regulatory commissions approved increases in the customer rates significantly, such that you started seeing costs rise and prices rise dramatically in the 1970s. Into the 1980s, it sort of flattened out a little bit. And the 90s as well. In the 2000s, you see costs and prices going up gradually, such that today, for example, the average price of electricity for a residential customer is about 17 cents per kilowatt hour. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was around 9 or 10 cents.
Professor Hirsch, if we could stay in the present moment, and I do appreciate we needed all this historical context, but I want to acknowledge a lot of people complain that publicly traded companies are bad systems for electrical utilities, and that is the landscape that we have today. And that's because they're driven by a profit model, but utilities are needed by all of us. Electricity is something that it's essentially a requirement to live in this day and age. It's not a product we can purchase like a couch. So do you think that's a fair critique of many of our electrical utilities?
Not necessarily. Electric utilities are regulated entities. So we have state regulatory bodies that monitor the costs of utility companies and approve rate increases and decreases, as they did for decades and decades. Regulation has many problems, to be sure, but regulation was set up early in the 20th century to make sure that private investor-owned companies do not exploit their monopoly status. And it has worked to restrain the exploitative operations of utilities. Utilities are allowed to make a profit above their cost, but they're not allowed to exploit their monopoly status and earn as much as they can. There are other models. There are municipal utilities which exist around the country, again, but they are subject to many of the same forces as utilities are. And
Professor Hirsch, if I may, forgive me for jumping in. I do want to take a moment and go to the phones and hear from Todd, who we have calling from Lake Orion.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I appreciate the conversation, something that certainly applies to all of us. And I'm glad that you're bringing up the idea of the utility commissions. But I guess in my regard is normally those are political appointments. Maybe with the effect that they have on all of the citizens, they should be politically elected because, I'm not going to get into the details, but consumers, they make large political contributions to both parties. They donate to Republicans, governors, local senators, and, they have lobbyists, which I guess is certainly not unique to them. But maybe the members of these utility commissions ought to be elected positions instead of selected positions so that there may be a little less backroom dealing and
yes, Todd, thank you for calling the Metro. That is a really interesting question. So Professor Hirsch, how much control do utility commissions have over the price of our electrical utility rates?
Absolutely. It is a great question, and it's one that has real relevance. Again, there are many problems with regulation, and there's a large body of evidence suggesting that regulators get captured by the industry that they serve. So indeed, regulators of electric utilities often and historically have been shown to be influenced by the utility industry itself to do its bidding and to raise rates when necessary or when the utility companies want them. The problem with elected commission, and indeed the caller was correct that in most states, the commissioners themselves are appointed by governors. and they are political appointees. In some states, I think Arizona is one of them, the regulators are actually elected. The problem with elections of commissioners is that they will often campaign to say, yes, I'm going to lower electric rates if I am elected. But a problem with that is that regulation generally tries to ensure that the utility companies earn enough money so that they can continue operating, so that they can attract investors and pay their bonds off, to pay interest on bonds. Utilities have to be financially secure enough so they can provide this essential service. If rates are lowered arbitrarily by elected commissioners, let's say, they run out of the money they need and they cannot provide the service that is expected. So regulation was set up to both protect consumers by preventing monopolistic charges, but also to protect utility companies, to ensure that the companies could earn enough so that they could be financially sound enough to provide this necessary service.
Okay.
Elections, yes, I understand the drive and the impetus for, the appreciation of democracy here, but and for elected officials. But the original idea for commissions was that there would be
Professor Hirsch, we're going to have to leave it right there.
Yeah.
Professor Richard Hirsch, he's a professor of history at Virginia Tech and the author of multiple books on American utilities. Thank you for breaking down this complex topic, Professor Hirsch. Thanks for joining the Metro as well.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Coming up, we'll hear about all the projects happening in our state transition to renewable energy sources. And we want to hear from you in this conversation. Do you think you're paying too much for the energy you use? Give us a call, 313-577-1019.
This is the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. Stay with us.
Welcome back to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. A lot of people want to make the transition to clean energy, from green energy groups to environmentalists and even a number of corporations. Over the past few years, Governor Gretchen Whitmer has done more than anyone before her to transition the state to operate on clean energy sources like wind and solar by 2040.
But Robin, the question is, how much needs to be done to implement this transition? And what are all the obstacles we are still facing to get there? To discuss this now, we have Christy McGillivray here. She's the Legislative and Political Director of the Sierra Club of Michigan, an environmental nonprofit. Christy, welcome to the Metro.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yes. The big thing the Whitmer administration and Democrats did on our energy transition, it happened in 2023 when it passed the Clean Energy and Jobs Act. That legislation is based on the My Healthy Climate Plan. Can you briefly tell us about this report?
Sure. When Governor Whitmer was first elected to office, she laid out the My Healthy Climate Plan, which was a cross-agency blueprint for how we could make the transition to 100% carbon-free economy in sectors across the board. So it was a plan on what she could do administratively without needing new laws, and it also became a part of the justification for our energy package, which you mentioned passed in 2023, which goes after specifically the utility sector and mandates that utilities in Michigan have to reach 100% clean energy by 2040.
And as noted in 2023, Whitmer passed bills that allow permitting for solar and wind as well as battery projects, and that require electric providers to establish a 100% clean energy portfolio by 2040. What was the most significant to you about what was in this legislative package?
Well, we worked really, really closely on it, and just, a minor point of clarity, it was the legislature that really drove that legislation, and really the environmental policy community, so Sierra Club and our partners. And the motivation there was to remove the legal barriers to actually generating renewable electricity, because until we passed that legislation, it was functionally illegal to actually get to 100% renewable energy.
I think my eyes just went, what? Like, what? I mean, but there are so many different things that a lot of us just are not privy to in terms of the expansion of some of the things that we would like to see happening in our state and in our cities. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed by the Biden administration, that had nearly $370 billion for tax credits to help build new battery plants and subsidize renewable energy projects. How big of a deal was federal legislation when it came to passing clean energy legislation in Michigan?
It was game-changing. It was the mandate and the justification to get on board with changing our own state laws. We could go to legislators with our members and say, hey, the federal government is going to be handing out billions of dollars to make this transition. In order to get that funding and reinvest in our communities and upgrade our grid and everything else, we have to get on board and enable that transition here with this energy package. So, for example, in Detroit, the solar projects that are currently underway to offset the energy used by municipal buildings, those are getting significant tax breaks, or it dropped the cost by 30% because of what the federal government did. It is going to take a massive amount of shared investment to transition to renewable energy, and the actions of the Biden administration were the first signal that the U.S. government was serious about actually cutting emissions and transitioning to renewables.
And, just thinking about Detroit, because that's something that you just threw in and I wanted to talk about as well. We're seeing so many of those, the solar projects happening and possible wind farms, and just renewable energy is starting to spread across the city of Detroit in different various ways. How much of this goes back to what we've been seeing, especially with Governor Whitmer's administration and the goal of 2040, the 2040 goal? How much do we see that playing into what's happening across the city of Detroit?
It's happening because of our clean energy package. It's happening because of the federal investment. But I do want to point out some really key things that are not happening that should. So the solar projects that are underway in Detroit, those are going to be owned by DTE, and they're intended to offset the energy being produced by city buildings. We don't see community solar, which would be small installations that are directly benefiting the people that subscribe to them, because community solar is still functionally illegal because we could not get enabling legislation for community solar through the state legislature. And that's because utilities, specifically DTE and consumers, because they're the biggest investor-owned utilities, they roadblocked it the entire way. And we were told multiple times that we were not going to see an expansion of distributed generation and community solar because of the amount of power and money that DTE has in Lansing.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Tia Graham. We're speaking with Christy McGillivray, the Legislative and Political Director of the Sierra Club of Michigan. We're discussing what the state is doing to transition our energy sources to clean technology, and we want to hear from you. Do you think you're paying too much for the energy you use? The number is 313-577-1019. Now, Christy, just to note, we did invite DTE onto the show. They have not called in yet, but we do hope that they will, especially after listening and hearing what you had to say. But Christy, just want to talk about the city of Detroit a little bit there and expand on that, because what needs to be done in order to give Detroiters that same access to renewable energy in their private homes or in their spaces? What needs to be done?
I mean, there's a laundry list, right? Mm-hmm. So asking anyone who's struggling to pay their bills to finance their own renewable energy installation is obviously not going to work. That's in part why the community solar approach is so important, because that allows people to invest what they can into installations that they directly benefit from. That is a threat to DTE's business model. That is why DTE repeatedly kills legislation that will allow that model to flourish. So we have to deal with frankly, money in politics in order to make it possible for people to have access to the kinds of renewable energy generation that they deserve.
You're listening to the Metro once again on WDET Detroit Public Radio. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're speaking with Christy McGillivray, the legislative and political director of the Sierra Club of Michigan. We're discussing what the state is doing to transition our energy sources to clean technology. And we want to hear from you. Do you think you're paying too much for the energy you use? Call in and tell us 313-577-1019. Now, there are a lot of green energy projects happening right now in Michigan, and I want to get into some of them. Residents in Gaylord, Michigan are upset about plans for 420 acres to be used as a solar farm. A new law allows state energy regulators to approve these kinds of projects despite local opposition, but the attitudes of people in rural areas still matter, of course. Can you talk about why people are upset about these changes and what you think needs to be done to convince them of the need to change?
Sure. I think first and foremost, we should remove the barriers that are keeping renewable energy from being built in places where people are clamoring for it. So we need stronger, carrots and sticks that the Michigan Public Service Commission can wield. We need community solar. We need distributed generation. There's a lot that we can do to fast track renewable energy production in places where everyone wants it. Instead of doing that, what we've done is functionally handed even more power to utilities to build utility scale projects. Now, we need to do both. The climate crisis is here. We've hit 1.5 degrees warming. This is a, everything under the sun approach. That being said, the reporting on what's been happening in Gaylord, I think, is pretty skewed. Frankly, it's, in my opinion, a ginned up controversy that is being used by one of the incoming legislators who's going to be in charge of the DNR's budget to gut the funding for the DNR.
Would you say you think this is more of a vocal minority situation here?
I have not talked to enough people in Gaylord to say for sure. I have spoken with my mother-in-law, who is from Gaylord, and when she found out that it was the scrubby stand of jack pines close to the Meyer parking lot, she was like, why is everyone so mad about this? So we are not deforesting old growth forest. They're looking at potentially, because the process hasn't even started, approving the lease of some land where there are already oil and gas wells, which no one has complained about. There are electrical transmission lines. There are absolutely no outdoor recreation access points that are going to be impacted. And most of these trees are going to be clear cut anyway because it's functionally a tree farm for biomass. So the claims being made about habitat destruction on this one particular parcel are deeply suspect given that information. And the actions that are being justified by this outrage over the farm extend far beyond where and how we should cite renewable energy. They're a direct attack on renewable energy itself and the state agencies that are actually tasked with protecting our natural resources for all of us to use.
Tell me what you're doing at the Sierra Club and what you think the state needs to be doing to build more solar and wind farms across Michigan where there's enough land to support it.
While we do have good enabling legislation, I do think that we need to get the public buy-in, right? And part of that is restoring the public trust in our political process to actually deliver for regular people. A thing that is incredibly important for people to realize is that we have not properly transitioned to renewable energy yet. The definition of renewable energy in our state law includes things that Sierra Club does not consider renewable. And,
such as?
For example, methane gas from farms. It includes biomass, and it includes, for example, gas plants if they're able to get carbon capture and sequestration up and running. And there's a little carve out that is going to continue allowing a trash incinerator in Kent County to still be considered renewable energy. And the general rule of thumb is that if you're burning something, it's probably not renewable, right?
That's right.
So anyway, so there's a broad definition, which is an issue. And so we need to address that and make sure that that's not something that utilities lean on. And then the other issue is electrical demand. And a huge problem is that as in the second half of this legislative session, there was a bill that popped up that was going to incentivize data centers. And you might be asking, what are those? What are we talking about? What's going on? Data centers are the server farms that are the backbone of artificial intelligence. They use a massive amount of electricity. We had a huge fight in the state legislature over whether or not we were going to incentivize these facilities without strong mandates that Silicon Valley tech billionaires have to build their own renewable energy for these things. We lost that fight. DTE helped to whip 36 Republicans to override the Democrats that were ready to vote against it to protect their own energy package. Governor Whitmer did not veto these bills. And now we are incredibly concerned that the electricity demand from the explosion of artificial intelligence is going to trigger off-ramps in our renewable energy package, which means that utilities will be able to build gas plants and make us pay for them. So we have not actually implemented the shift to renewable energy yet. And I think folks should know that Jerry Norcia is the president of the American Gas Association. I'm sorry, chairman of the board. And that is the gas association that has invested its entire business model in keeping us on methane gas. So we're going to be facing a lot of fights locally and at the Public Service Commission level to make sure that we're actually investing in renewables and we're not using the justified demand coming from data centers to build more gas plants that are driving climate change that we're all going to have to pay more for.
Christy, this sounds like a very underreported topic, the unintended consequences of AI, because the big thing that we're all talking about are the ethical concerns, but these deep environmental impacts from your perch, would you say that this is very much not understood, not very well known?
Yes. And there's been some fantastic national reporting, in particular from the Washington Post. You do a quick Google, everything pops up. Frankly, it's all exploded within about a year and a half because that's how fast the AI boom is moving. Secretary of Energy, previous Secretary of Energy, former Governor Granholm was cautioning about this on the last days of her administration. She was warning about the energy use of artificial intelligence and what that's going to mean. So there is some reporting out there. It does need more attention, and we need to make sure that we're maintaining the integrity of our media because that reporting is going to be contradicting some of the most powerful players that are unelected in federal government right now.
Let's stay on a topic that feels a little bit perhaps more hopeful, and that is some examples of what certain cities in Michigan are doing right now and how viable those things could be for other places. I'm thinking about Ann Arbor. In the fall, the city approved the creation of a sustainable energy utility, and that's to provide solar power to city residents. The city wants to build solar arrays that support entire neighborhoods, but that means coming to some kind of agreement with DTE to use their poles and wires to move that energy from the array to customers. How ambitious is this plan and how likely is it that it will be realized?
It will be realized. I mean, what Ann Arbor basically did with the sustainable energy utility is set up community solar for the city of Ann Arbor. So people will be able to subscribe to renewable energy that they can guarantee is going to be generated close to their homes, right? What Ann Arbor is doing that's much more ambitious and really interesting is that they're considering municipalization, in which they would actually purchase all the infrastructure from DTE and set up a completely publicly owned utility that is accountable only to residents and ratepayers and not shareholders. That's very interesting, and that is coming down the pipeline as well.
Christy McGillivray is the legislative and political director of the Sierra Club of Michigan. Thank you so much for stopping by on this cold day and joining us on the Metro.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Coming up on the Metro, we'll discuss what needs to happen to more quickly get our electrical utility companies to transition to clean energy sources. Give us a call. Tell us, do you feel like you pay too much for your energy? The number is 313-577-1019.
It's the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. Stay with us.
to the Metro. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We've been discussing what it will take to drive down the cost of energy. And we've been exploring why our state and our utility companies are attempting to transition to clean energy sources. But it's not just Michigan utility companies. Utilities across the nation are being made to transition to wind and solar. Some have already jumped deep into that. And yet many are privately owned and publicly traded.
That is right, Robin, and we want to know how that fact is impacting the transition. To discuss this now, we have Mark Dyson here. Mark is the managing director of the Rocky Mountain Institute, a sustainability think tank. Mark, welcome to the Metro.
Thanks for having me.
So, utilities across the country have pledged to transition to 100% renewable energy by 2060, and some have pledged to transition a lot sooner. How would you assess the transition electrical utilities are making to clean energy? How quickly is this happening?
It's happening very quickly, and it's driven by a number of advances in a handful of technologies that are just getting better and better every year, like wind and solar, for example, are more affordable than they've ever been and saving U.S. consumers billions of dollars on avoiding use of coal and gas and oil, especially on cold days like today across the country.
And what needs to be done at the state and federal level to make these utility companies transition a little bit faster?
Well, at the federal level, I think a couple things come to mind. The first is cutting some red tape and removing unnecessary barriers for infrastructure investment that support renewable energy projects. Some of these projects are waiting in line for 5 years or more just for their turn to connect to the grid. Another thing at the federal level that's very important is to plan ahead for infrastructure investments. So we need extended support for regional and nationwide planning that can enable investment in long-term infrastructure like transmission lines, which are really critical for supporting reliability and keeping prices low as we see demand for electricity increasing nationwide.
Speaking federally, what is going to happen with the investments in clean energy now that Trump is in office?
I think there's a really important opportunity to maintain a focus on affordability for electricity customers across the country. So recent legislation passed over the last few years has really helped keep electricity prices down and supported utilities in taking huge steps forward at the same time in their transition to clean energy. So a couple examples, the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office has been announcing a number of deals, including $12 billion of conditional guarantees for utilities in Michigan to lower costs, expand infrastructure in needed equipment that will help improve reliability, all the while improving and accelerating these utilities' clean energy transition. So I think that focus on affordability is really important going forward.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're speaking with Mark Dyson, Managing Director of the Rocky Mountain Institute, a sustainability think tank. We're discussing what needs to happen to push utility companies to transition to clean energy sources. And we want to hear from you. Do you feel you're paying too much for the energy you use? Call in and tell us 313-577-1019. And Mark, when you talk about how important it will be that affordability is front and center to clean energy, I'm thinking about my time living in Wyoming, and I had the option to pay for wind-powered energy, but I had to pay extra for that. Can you talk a little bit more about the need to ensure not only that we're moving toward this clean energy, but making it affordable and what that looks like for the average person?
Yeah. Well, until not very long ago, wind power and solar power did come at a premium relative to other sources of electricity. But the important thing to realize is that that's changed now. And in fact, wind and solar power can be in many states the cheapest form of electricity to add to the grid and help meet reliability needs and keep customer costs low. So what's needed now is for utilities to take a proactive view of what else is required in addition to investment in wind and solar projects, including things like transmission, including things like battery energy storage, which is showing up in a big way over the past couple of years to keep reliability and keep prices low. I was just looking at electricity prices in Texas yesterday on a very cold morning. batteries showed up before the sun rose to mitigate the increase in prices that came with folks waking up and starting their days. So there's just a broad portfolio of solutions that utilities need to be considering to take most advantage of wind and solar costs.
Interesting. Yeah, and we think of Texas as this big oil and gas state. Tell me, what states would you say are transitioning their utility companies to clean energy sources fastest, and also which ones are doing a really good job already?
Yeah. Well, let's stick with Texas for a minute. 20 years ago or so, Texas had a pretty forward-looking view of what would be required to fully tap the cost-effective renewable energy resources that sat out in West Texas. So they invested significant amounts of money in infrastructure to bring that low-cost power to the cities in eastern Texas, and that's paying dividends now, with Texans saving billions of dollars a year through the use of low-cost wind and solar in the western part of the state that are being brought to the eastern part of the state through transmission lines. So Texas is in some ways a great example, and I already mentioned how batteries are helping keep the lights on. Other states have different versions of what they're doing well. So, for example, in states like New York, they've taken a look at how it's possible to really leverage the power of small-scale home energy technologies like EV chargers or smart thermostats or home batteries, and add up all those small little devices in millions of people's homes to create a very large number of smart devices that can help support reliability and keep the lights on while lowering prices. So states like New York and my home state of Colorado have taken a different approach to some innovation that help their utilities move faster towards clean energy.
Yes, I appreciated that as well, living in Colorado myself. Mark, in the last 30 seconds that we have, are there things that people can be doing right now to push their utilities to transition more quickly?
I think a lot of important action can take place at public utility commissions or public service commissions across the country to both empower consumers, like I was just saying, help let consumers save money by using their home energy devices, and also protect consumers and shield them from volatile fossil fuel prices that, especially on cold days like today, can soar, and that money ends up going to consumers' bills.
Mark Dyson is the managing director of the Rocky Mountain Institute, a sustainability think tank. Mark, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thanks for having me.
That's the Metro for Tuesday, January 21st. The show is produced by Sam Corey, Carey Jr. II, and Jack Philbrandt. Our engineer is Nate Bender, and our senior producer is David Lyons. The Metro is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University.
This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.